Language is a lot like life, in the sense that, it's something we all have. But it's not always that easy to explain, that easy to understand, and we don't always use it the way we should. Just like life, we don't always live life the way we should. I want to go ahead and start talking about language, and the title is interesting because we're going to see that that language can only have one of two explanations, and these explanations are opposed to each other. Only one can be true. Either language is something that comes from God, or language originated with humans. There can be no mix of the two. And our decision on that, our outlook as to whether language is divine or not, has a direct effect on evangelism. And let's find out why. But first, let's talk a little bit about language, about linguistics. And linguistics, as most of you probably know, is the science or the systematic study of human language. And language is studied by looking at its structure, and also by looking at its how it's used. When we talk about structure, that we're talking about how the words are put together in sentences, and also how the words are formed. And we look at the relationship between structure and use. Language also studies its development through time, the history, and it also studies how children and adults learn language. That's called acquisition. Now, within the scopes of linguistics, we look at language structure, that's titled grammatical competence. And we also study the use of language, that is titled communicative competence. Now, the areas of study in linguistics are those which you see there. Missing a comma there after syntax. We have phonetics, phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics. And in case you don't remember, phonetics. Does anyone remember? Can anyone tell me what we mean by phonetics?
The sound.
Excellent, very good. Yes, the sounds. How we produce the sounds, how we transmit the sounds, how we receive the sounds, how we analyze the sounds, and how we classify the sounds. That is the field of phonetics. How about phonology?
How we got to the phonics?
Well, phonology, very good, very good. Phonology, those are the elements that affect the flow of speech sounds. Now that sounds very highfalutin. What do you think that would be?
Rhythm, like the rhythm of the language.
Consonants, vowels, and their combinations into syllables. Those are what we call the phonological elements.
That's how we got to the phonics.
Morphology. Morphology, that is the study of the words with meaning, and these are formed with the phonological elements. The vowels, consonants, placed in the syllables. The syllables then are placed, come together to form words. And then semantics. Well, and syntax, who remembers that from high school, junior high school? You, sir?
Structure of a sentence.
That's right. Syntax would be that how we put the words into different orders. And then semantics studies the propositions that are made through these sentences, the ideas that are expressed by a sentence. Very good. Next. We have specialized branches in linguistics, And these are some of them, most of them. So as you can see, it becomes very technical and very diverse. But we have applied linguistics, cognitive linguistics, contact, corpus linguistics, discourse analysis, forensic linguistics, graphology, historical linguistics, that's a very important one, language acquisition, lexicology. Lexicology then refers, of course, to the volume of words in a language. Linguistic anthropology, you heard Adam mention that. Neurolinguistics, paralinguistics, pragmatics, psycholinguistics, sociolinguistics, and stylistics. And stylistics does not refer to hairdo or anything like that, but rather to the different styles in which we write or express ourselves. Language is quite possibly the most complex function the human being performs. And because of the way language works at different levels, listen to this, many linguists consider language to be theoretically infinite in its expression. Practically, this is not the case. But at a theoretical level, language is infinite. But I think what we need to do is take an earthly approach in order to understand just how fantastic this is, and to be able to decide, is this something that was divine? Is this something that is divine? Or is this something that evolved? So when most people think about language, they think about speaking, they think about the mouth, the tongue, the lungs, the teeth, the lips, and even gestures. You're watching me gesture. But people who cannot hear, people who cannot speak or see or gesture still have language skills, and they're able to use language very well. There are people who do not have a vocal capacity, and they're still able to comprehend language, and they can still express themselves in different forms. Now, there are examples of people who have lost the capacity for language due to brain injury or stroke. I think the name of that illness is aphasia. And what happens is that the part of the brain where language resides has been injured, and so language for this person is lost. However, they can still sing, or they can still vocalize to some degree. This shows that the basis for language is not in our vocal cords nor in our hands, but rather that the ability for language resides in the brain. And how human beings came to have this capacity for language, or how did language originate, in other words, and how the first language formed. These are two questions that remain pretty much unanswered for linguist scholars. Now, at the beginning of Western civilization, the approach to the study of language, to the study of the origin of language, was rather philosophical in nature. And there were two schools of thought. The conventionalists, who understood language, they believed that the form of language, the words, the sounds, and the meaning were determined by society and that used that language, and therefore language was arbitrary. Now, the next group, these were the naturalists. They believed that the form of a word, its sound, was associated with the thing that it represented in the real world. So they believed that words had an automatic relation with what they represented. So, since there were not many onomatopoetic words, the science of etymology was developed to explain how most words could be associated to a root in onomatopoeia. Now, most of you probably watched The Three Stooges when you were growing up, right? And I think you all remember the episode of Moe doing surgery. and he is uttering off words, and one of the words happens to be onomatopoeia, right? Does anyone know what the word actually means? Onomatopoeia.
Sounds like.
Yes. And it's pronounced two ways. Onomatopoeic and onomatopoetic are words that sound like what they mean. Swish. Yeah. Bomb. Very good. So presently, there are two fundamental and opposing beliefs on the origin of language. We've already touched on this. With the dominance of Judeo-Christian values in Western civilization, the predominant belief concerning the origin of language up until the 19th century, more or less, had been the biblical narrative, the divine origin belief. The belief that language was given by God is based on the creation narrative found in Genesis. From Genesis 1:26, it can be inferred that God created man with the capacity to speak. And since God speaks and man was created in his image, then man is able to speak. And according to this belief, either God created Adam with the capacity and the ability to speak, meaning that he began speaking right away, or God taught him how to speak and honed his language skills by asking him to name the animals. And this way, he was imitating God, because God as well assigned names during creation. So, in the Genesis account, we see a record of intelligent and complex communication between God and man. So, the publication of Darwin's work in 1859 affected all areas of science, including linguistics, although not as much as other science disciplines due to the linguist's insistence on basing speculation on observable empirical data, and also on the fact that language leaves no fossils. Nevertheless, this has not presented a second hypothesis about language about language origin, known as the natural evolution belief. Now we're going to talk a little bit about this. I think it's important because as you analyze some of the ideas and look at elements contained in this belief, you're going to find that much of this has crept into the normal Christian thinking. So, now according to this belief, at some point in man's evolutionary development, the brain became larger, more sophisticated, and formed the capacity to create and learn language. The evolution of language began with an animal, or with the primitive ancestor of man. Man's hominids or primate ancestors communicated in the same way as animals through grunts, growls, howlings, body movements, and gestures. But along their evolution, these ancestors began to develop larger brains, and some of these grunts became words. Now do you remember what Adam said about the importance of translation being that it resides more in the receptor than on the source, the originator? Well, that is according to evolution. The reason why grunts, according to evolution, and growls and gestures became words is because when people would hear or see, not even people, hominids, would hear and see these things, and that they would understand them to be what they thought they were, the one producing these said, "Ah, I was understood. I'll grunt that way again." And so, as these beings evolved, they had these larger brains. Suddenly, they acquired what was called a language acquisition device, which provided them the capacity for language and thus more specific communication and greater superiority over other species. So, after they have their language acquisition device, they're able to produce more specific communication, and the species then produces a language, and the culture evolves and becomes more complex. It should be noted that there is no proof of a gradual language process. And all archaeological evidence of past languages has been that the past languages, even in primitive societies, are complex languages. So there is no meet Tarzan, you Jane. No record of that. The hypothesis about language development, the hypotheses, because there are more than several, are based on the idea that since humans, through evolution, acquired a language acquisition device, they started to invent, as I said, language from primitive grunts, sounds, and movements. And the first hypotheses, the first four, are based on imitating, next slide please. They're called the imitating hypotheses. They're based on humans imitating natural sounds. If these names sound ridiculous, it's because they are. And these names were given by linguists. So some of them probably thought that this was a joke as well. The first hypothesis is called the ding-dong hypothesis, and it proposes that the first words were voice imitations of sounds made by things in nature. A good example of this would be gulp. Okay? Animals also gulp, human beings gulp. So gulp became gulp. Another very good example is that in the Chinook Indian language, the word for heart is tum-tum. So, can you imagine a Chinook cardiologist speaking with his patient? Your tum-tum is tum-tuming irregularly. Now, the second hypothesis is called the poo-poo hypothesis, and it states that the first words were natural reactive hominid sounds caused by feelings like hunger, pain, sadness, happiness. These sounds began to be used as words to name the actions or things that caused those feelings, and these sound words led to other words for similar or more developed thought and emotions. The third hypothesis is called the bow wow, and that is that language came from animal sounds, and that's why it's called the bow wow hypothesis. So a dog is a bow wow, a cow is a moo, etc., etc. Now, the fourth hypothesis, the Tata hypothesis, was actually suggested by Darwin. And this hypothesis postulates that hand gestures became represented by mouth sounds. And they formed words from these sounds. So somehow gesturing towards someone by extending your arm and hand became equivalent to coming up with, "Here's John." Well, even Darwin thought that it was a bit of a stretch and thought that it was silly. Nevertheless, it was an idea that he put forth. So the main problem with these hypotheses is that they are based on onomatopoeia. And words of this type, as you can imagine, are highly subjective. And while they're present in every language, they're a small part of the vocabulary. And the imitation sounds differ from one language to another. That's why I asked you if anyone was bilingual. Ma'am, do you know how a dog barks in French?
Not in French, but I know in German.
How does a dog bark in German?
Vow, vow.
Very good. That's not how a dog barks in Spanish, nor in Chinese, nor in Russian. It's somewhat similar to English, but there are similarities between French and English.
Do you want to know how a rooster crows?
How does
I
it-
love
yes.
this one. I love
Yeah.
this one. In German, a rooster crows, kikadaki.
Very good. How does a rooster crow in English? Cock-a-doodle-doo. And the rooster crows in Spanish, kikiriki. just like in German, or French probably.
None of them are how roosters really crow.
So I think you get the idea, right? And so, and the question is then, well, let's say that we do have these onomatopoeic words, poetic words, I'm sorry. How then do we get from those words to more abstract words, right? There still isn't an explanation for that. After all, what sound does a rock make? Right? And how did we get bovine, or cow, or bull, or Taurus from moo? Well, Taurus, the Latin. By the way, cows moo. Bulls. Does anyone know that the noise that bulls make? They do not moo. Bull, no. Well, they snort. They have a very deep snort. Yeah. So, you know, to me, all this sounds like a whole lot of bull. The three other hypotheses are called the necessity hypotheses. And they explain that language developed out of necessity. The first one is the warning hypothesis, and that this says that people made warning sounds to alert a fellow hunter or tribesman of imminent danger, and these sounds became words. So pointing and screaming that there was a bear became run for your lives. The yo-he-yo hypothesis says that sounds that people uttered when working together became words. And this explains why soldiers sing nonsensical songs when they're doing drills. Or probably the yo-he-yo was probably taken from the soldiers marching around the Wicked Witch, the Wicked Witch of the East castle. So. And then the last hypothesis of the necessity ones is the lying hypothesis. And this hypothesis postulates that people sometimes give away their real intentions through involuntary body language and sounds. And so people had to invent words in order to cover up their true intentions. Now we're getting somewhere. So anyway, these are hypotheses of language origin. Now these ideas are not considered serious explanations by most linguists. Number 7, please. And by the end of the 19th century, certain linguistic organizations in Europe had actually banned discussion or papers on the origin of language because the ideas proposed were so outlandish they had no scientific basis. So as you can see, this is what happened up until the 19th century. Both groups of hypotheses, the imitation and the necessity hypotheses, might explain how some words were formed given a certain context. But these words, as we said, make up a very small portion of the vocabulary, and they don't provide an explanation for more complex thinking. Now, another aspect of language that is very interesting is grammar. Do you know that there is no explanation for grammar? None. Grammar is the most unique feature of language. Grammar is the prescribed forms or word patterns with a definite function in the language that allow the intended meaning to be communicated. Now, did everyone understand that? Okay. Grammar is part of language. This is going to floor you. I mean, when I first realized it floored me. If language was not created by man, then neither was grammar. Because grammar is part of language. And linguists now today talk about innate grammar, but they have no explanation for it. So, now, So human beings are not the only ones who communicate. Animals communicate as well. And we sometimes are able to communicate with animals, of course. But there is no grammar in any type of communication, only in human communication. Next slide, please. According to Dr. Les Bruce, the first philosophical debates on language were discussions about the regularity of language patterns or grammar. And from these two theoretical positions, there emerged as explanations for language development, language irregularity and language regularity. What this means is that there was the idea that language was irregular in its presentation, that it could assume different forms. Language regularity said no, language has a proper form, and this became the predominant position. But the irregularities that were viewed was explained by saying that language would become corrupt due to incorrect use, and consequently the older forms of language were considered to be more pure. So this professor reported that until the 19th century, the discussions on language origins continued to be philosophical, and then during the 19th century, there was a very harsh reaction to the large amount of speculation in these philosophical discussions. And the result was that they were to take a more scientific approach, a more structured approach in studying empirical language data, and more scholarly work was done in developing comparative language principles in an effort to reconstruct the past of language. This work led to the reconstruction of what was called the Indo-European language and to the discovery of how what they call change processes produce the diversity of language, of the Indo-European languages. The research that was done allowed some linguists to identify what they call the sound change, the regularity of sound change in a language. And a leading linguist of the 20th century, the name is Herman Paul, attributed convenience as the main cause of sound change and mispronunciation. So Bruce also reported that the American linguist Bloomfield categorized sound change into two basic types of mechanisms: a stabilizing mechanism, which is a restructuring one, and a deterioration, which is called simplification. And both of these types had a number of different processes. Now, if this is getting a little bit confusing, what we're talking about is how language in time was actually changing. And instead of philosophizing about it, they started doing empirical studies, and they began to develop records, and they were able to see that, in fact, there were changes taking place in language, and they were able to categorize those changes. And they found these two principles, actions working in language. These two basic principles are called the process of streamlining, which is actually this one, simplification, and the process of restructuring, which is the stabilizing one. The French linguist Martinet, considered one of the most distinguished linguists of the 20th century, formulated these principles and considered that the restructuring process, in an effort to maintain proper communication, was in constant conflict with the streamlining process, which results from the human tendency to keep any type of work at a minimum. Now, I know this sounds confusing. I'm going to give you a very simple example, and you'll understand everything I just said. These principles of restructuring and simplification have a big impact on language usage, because that's where they see it. How many know how many pronouns? Well, how many pronouns do we have in English when when talking about the second person, the subject pronoun.
You.
Very good. Singular, right? And plural. All right. This was not the case always in English. In English, we had 3. But it became easier just to use 2. Right? That is an example of deterioration or simplification. But what happens there? Ambiguity is introduced into the language, right? The language itself corrects itself in this. A very common way of saying you plural, excellent, very good, Shane. A very common way of saying you plural in parts of the United States is you all. There's also in the northeastern part of the United States, I haven't heard it, my wife has experienced, but some areas say use.
Use.
Yes, some of you have heard that. So this is an example of these 2 principles, stabilizing and simplification. Now, so Martinet then said this: linguistic evolution may be regarded as governed by the permanent conflict between man's communicative needs and his tendency to reduce to a minimum his mental and physical activity. Here, as elsewhere, human behavior is subject to the law of least effort. Now, this is important. Keep this in mind. So up until the latter part of the 19th century, language theoreticians had philosophized about language change at its origin. Now, through research and documentation, they were able to observe that language exhibited what appeared to be consistent principles that governed its form and usage. Bruce states that 2 very important observations can be based from these principles. Next slide, please. Number 1, there is no such thing as primitive languages. If the process of simplification is as it has been observed in language, then the direction is from what? From complex to less complex, with the opposing force of restructuring to maintain meaning. Principle number 2, language exhibits creativity. The most creative part of language is its vocabulary. And through the principles of language, languages will readapt their lexical material, borrowing from other languages instead of creating or inventing entirely new words. So, many linguists believe that these 2 opposing principles create equilibrium, and Professor Ronald Langacker of the University of California, San Diego, he's still alive. This gentleman is the creator was the creator of cognitive grammar. He states, just as there are no primitive languages, there are no corrupt languages. Languages change, but they do not decay. So, now, we're talking about the streamlining and the restructuring. There are no studies in which linguists can... If the restructuring process were to be dominant, then it would result in an improved language. It would give us language that is evolving. But that is not what is indicated from the research data. To believe that language evolved from animal communication to primitive vocalizations to advanced language would be to deny or reinterpret the research data based on the presupposition of evolution as an overarching principle. So neither the historical linguistic studies nor the archaeological or any other type of studies have been able to identify stages of developmental language followed by set periods of simplifications that would be necessary if language had a prehistoric development. Did that make sense? Slide number 10. William Laboff, a prominent American sociolinguistic and a proponent of language evolution, stated the following in his thesis. It is plain, meaning obvious, to most linguists that the destroy and rebuild theory of linguistic evolution, simplification, restructuring, is equivalent to claiming that the whole process is dysfunctional. For the systematic part is the destructive one, and the analogical reshaping seems to be making the best of a bad job. And if the principle of least effort is the evil genius behind the destruction, we can only look at language change as a kind of massive testimony to original sin. Now, let's put this in simple terms. Do you know what he's saying? In simple terms, if an original language did exist, then that language would have to be the most pure and perfect language one could conceive. And every derivation, I mean everything that derives from it, would be a degradation. While Laboff recognizes the dysfunctional role of language change, he does not deny that language change results in diversification and not in overall complexity or improvement. What he attempts to do is to find functional evolutionary language to promote evolution of human society, but he has not been able to prove the existence of an improvement role for language change within the development of language. In other words, he assumes that it has to be there because he says society has improved, but he has not been able to find proof for it. Now, going back to what they've taught us about evolution, evolution is an improvement process, right? Things improve. Language development, if it does exist, listen to this, seems to be dominated by a dysfunctional process. A dysfunctional process is what? Anti-evolutionary. They cannot find proof of it, but even if they were to be able to find proof of it, it is being guided by something that is contrary to everything they posit. Professor Bruce, who is a Christian, concludes either the streamlining and restructuring processes balance each other, or the streamlining process is gradually reducing language to a limited system of overgeneralities. Either human languages have always existed with essentially the potential they exhibit now, or they once exhibited greater potential for precise communication than they do now. Did everyone understand this? Professor Bruce is saying that the evidence appears to be that language was better in the past. As stated earlier, given the complexity of language and its regenerative ability of recombining, many linguists view language as theoretically infinite in its capacity of expression. However, looking at language by itself, there is no evidence that language is the product of any positive development process. Consistent change appears to be a characteristic of language, which at best seems to maintain a state of equilibrium in practice. So, while empirical science won't regard the Bible as a reliable record, and even though it has been tested time and time again, and science does not consider God as a credible witness, what scholars do recognize is that there has never been a society of humans without language. Anthropological and historical linguists have stated unequivocally that primitive tribes possessed language just as complex, if not more, than modern languages. There is no such thing as a primitive language. linguist Suzette Elgin, in her book, What is Linguistics, published in 1973, wrote that the most ancient languages for which we have written texts, a good example is Sanskrit, are far more intricate and complicated in their grammatical forms than many contemporary languages. It seems that intelligent and complex language has always been a characteristic of human society. But they will readily admit that language, how it came to be, is still a mystery, a great unknown which cannot be proved. Research has not been able to determine an origin of language, and there is no evidence of evolutionary development, number one. Number two, language, theoretically, is infinite. Number three, language at the same time is creative and yet static. Number four, intelligent and complex language is exhibited only by human beings. Language has no beginning, it has no end, it is creative, and it changes, but its function remains the same. I think there probably is no doubt in your mind why Jesus is called the Word. Right? Let's talk a little bit about what we can say about translation. Let's talk just generalities about translation, because in the same way that linguistics is rather technical and difficult to understand, translation is also the same way. But its nature is easy to comprehend. The Bible records God as speaking, correct? We have God speaking in the beginning, and we have God speaking at the very end. Now, God spoke creation into existence, and right now it's very popular to say that communication begins when those who receive the communication are able to understand it. Well, the question I have for that, when God spoke, who was there to receive that communication? Unless, of course, when God said, "Let there be light," was God speaking to himself? Was God speaking to nothing? Or was God speaking with the other members of the Godhead? God has power over language. We see that especially Genesis 11:7. You probably recognize that as the account of what happened at Babel, right? It was God who confused the languages, and it was there also, where it's recorded in Scripture, that all the people had what? One language. And it was God who confused the language. And then Acts 17, we have Paul talking about God being the one who created the specific nations. And then Paul also gives the reason for that, which would be so that men would call upon him, right? In Scripture, we also see that God teaches man the ability to speak and use language. Remember the confrontation between God and Moses? Moses, you're going to do this. No, I can't do that. Yes, you're going to do this. I don't know how to speak. Well, I will teach you how to speak. Now, this is where we get to the interesting part. The Bible assumes translated information. The Bible assumes that translated information was communicated accurately. And we have just three examples of three books where we are able to infer, or it is mentioned that communication occurred in different languages. Another point, Jewish scholars of the 12th century believe that Job was written first in another language, and it was then translated into into Hebrew. Next slide, please. Here are the things that we need to consider. Daniel was bilingual. Paul was bilingual. Jesus presupposes translation and interpretation. Why do you think I say that, based on those scriptures? You have the Great Commission, right? He told the disciples to do what?
All nations.
All nations. And to do what? To teach them, to tell them about him, to teach what he had taught them. Well, in one language? No. We would have to infer that the command here is to do the work and that there be translation. What about Acts 1:8? Same thing, right? Receiving power of the Holy Spirit and going not just into the immediate area, but all over. So, also other languages, and we made reference, one of the ladies made reference to that already about speaking in tongues. Other languages communicated truth accurately about God, and this was by the power of God. The Syriac was the translation of the Old Testament from Hebrew that was done early on, and Jesus, given his environment, probably spoke more than one language. You're probably wondering, what does all of this have to do with translation? And what is this? How is this related to evangelism? It's very simple. Either God gave language or he did not. If he did not give language, then language is full of error, and this cannot be trusted. But if God did give language, and if God did know that we would have to translate in order to follow his commands, then it can be trusted. And we don't have to recur to ideas or theories or practices based on evolution in order to do the work that God has given us to do. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that the principles put forth by scientists cannot be used. Yes, they can be. But evolution does not have to be our presupposition in order